Yeah, so welcome everyone to the second event of our Poetry in Transatlantic Translation Colloquium series. So I'm Zoe Scolding at Bangor University, and in a moment I'm going to be handing over to my co-organiser Dan Eltringham from Sheffield, and he in turn will tell us more about our guests, Hugo García Manríquez and the NAFTA Collective, so more about them in a moment. So we also have a number of UK universities involved in this series through Contempo, which is a research series that's been meeting virtually for about 15 years. And it's co-directed by myself and John Wrighton from Brighton, Gavin Goodwin from Aberystwyth, Mandy Bloomfield from Plymouth, and Stephen Mooney from Surrey. And this particular series is also a collaboration with the Sheffield Centre for Poetry and Poetics, which is organised by Aggie Dahosky. So after tonight, we have two more events coming up. So the next one will feature the Chilean variant of Language is a Virus on June the 17th. So this will be performance and discussion of sound and visual poetry from Chile. And you'll have to come along to find out whether the Chilean variant is an infection or a vaccine. But we're very excited to be welcoming Felipe Cusson, Ana Maria Breda, Martin Bequero, Pia Sommer, and Martin Gubbins. And then our last event on June the 27th, we'll be exploring networks, magazines, and materials with Catalan poet and scholar Jessica Pujol, based in Chile, Rebecca Kosick, a US poet and lecturer in translation studies based in the UK, and the Mexican scholar Juan Francisco Rangel Yanez. So you can sign up for these events via Eventbrite on the same page as you found this one. So this series is also a preparation for an in-person conference in Bangor in June 2022, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and the call for papers is open if you'd like to contribute to the discussions that we're hoping to generate here. So Dan Eltringham's British Academy funded postdoctoral research at Sheffield traces translations of Latin American poetries of resistance by Anglo-American poetry networks since the 1960s. And it's a great pleasure to work with him on this series that we hope is going to spark new and multilingual conversations across the Atlantic. So over to Dan.
Thank you very much, Zoe, for that generous mini intro to my intro. I think Zoe already mentioned housekeeping, but yeah, if you could please keep your mics muted during the presentations, but obviously please do keep your cameras on if you would like to. And just throw kind of questions and comments into the chat as we go along, really, as is customary now in these digital spaces. So this series traces multilingual poetic exchanges of an expanded transatlantic field, broadly conceived. And tonight's event may put some pressure on that term by thinking about the transatlantic space alongside and in tension with the hemispheric América. For this second event, we're really delighted to welcome the poet and translator Hugo García Manríquez and the newly formed and cheekily named NAFTA Collective, which stands not for the notorious trade treaty, which came into force on the first day of 1994, but for the North American Free Translation Agreement. So this NAFTA collective, who we're going to hear from in a moment, were ratified in 2019, and it consists of Canada and the US. Sarmiento Cruz, Zane Koss, and Whitney DeVos. And together they've translated Hugo García Manríquez's long poem, Lo Común, the Commonplace, which brilliantly excavates and substitutes scenes of culture, violence, militarization, history, and language in Mexico's troubled present. Hugo and the members of NAFTA are going to perform and discuss the poem and their translation in a moment. But before that, I will just very quickly give you their bios, and then we'll crack on, as they say in Sheffield. So Hugo García Manríquez is a Mexican poet and translator based in Oakland. His poetry publications include Lo Común and Anti-Humboldt, a reading of the North American Free Trade Agreement from 2015, an erasure text which, in the words of Tripwire, doesn't only bring to light hidden resonances within master texts, but can also draw attention to those voices, bodies, and histories erased from consideration in NAFTA or TLC, Tratado de Libre Comercio, and its neoliberal project. His translations include most recently a selection of the British poet Sean Bonney's poetry, El lenguaje de las barricadas, which was published a few weeks ago by Editorial Matadero with Commune Editions and Tripwire. And I know there's a lot of excitement about this book. And if we if it seems like we have time towards the end, Hugo might share a few of his translations with us, which would be wonderful. Other translations include Oppin's Of Being Numerous and Williams's Patterson. And earlier publications in English include 2 poems and Painting is Finite, and in Spanish, No Oscuro Todavía and Los Materiales. And then onto the members of the NAFTA collective. Gerónimo Sarmiento Cruz is a humanities teaching fellow at the University of Chicago and editor of Chicago Review. His translations, poetry, and criticism have appeared in Tripwire, Denver Quarterly, Asymptote, La Tempestad, and elsewhere. Whitney DeVos is a writer, translator, and scholar living in Mexico City. She's translator of Notes Toward a Pamphlet by Sergio Chefek, 2020, The Semblable by Chantal Maya, 2020 as well as co-translator with Valeria Meya of the Spanish portions of A Year in the Sky, a collection of 12 poets from across the Americas and their writings about the zodiac. And short form translations by Whitney have also appeared in Chicago Review, Latin American Literature Today, and others. And additional work is forthcoming in Denver Quarterly, Michigan Quarterly Review, and MPT. She is a PhD candidate at UC Santa Cruz, finishing up a dissertation that examines documentary poetry in the hemispheric Americas from World War II to NAFTA. And lastly, but not leastly, we have Zane Koss, who is a poet, scholar, translator, and resident alien living in Brooklyn. His critical and creative work can be found at Tripwire, Asymptote, Chicago Review, the Thames Review, and elsewhere. He's published 4 chapbooks of poetry: The Odes, Incomplete, 2020, In Vermeer Grids, 2019, Job Site, that has an uncanny resonance, I'm sure, from 2018, and Warehouse Zone from 2015. And Zane is a doctoral candidate in the English department at NYU, where he researches Canadian, Mexican, and US poetry in the 60s and 70s. So I'm gonna hand over to Hugo and the NAFTA gang now, but I would just quickly say something about the shape of the evening, or morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. They're going to read from Hugo's poem for about half an hour, interchanging Spanish and English, and then after that we'll have a discussion about their work and their projects and the kind of ideas being played with in the NAFTA collective, and then we'll open up to the audience. So it should last around 1.5 hours at an absolute max. So going on till about for about 1.5 hours. So and obviously do just take a break if you need to. Okay, so I'm going to say thank you very much again to our guests for this evening and hand over to them for the readings.
Hi everyone, should I just go ahead and start reading? Whitney, yeah, okay. Let's see, so I'll be reading from Lo Común, which is my copy with a little bit of chocolate here on the top. I think it was my daughter. Let's see, and that's the last copy I have, so good thing. So sections 1 and 2. Empujamos a un lado la historia, la volvemos nuestra propia índice de calidad. Aspectos unos de otros, el mundo que nos produjo. Momentos para entonar aspectos, otros momentos de discusiones sobre poesía que en el fondo son discusiones sobre política. En esas discusiones, en esos momentos, los poemas entonan aspectos, aspectos reunidos y aspectos separados. Cuando el poema entona aspectos de unos y otros, reunidos, separados, en verdad entona 45 camionetas equipadas con rayos X para la SSP, entona en verdad 43 escáneres de iones para la Sedena, 155 kits de detección CT-30. El poema entona aviones no tripulados, helicópteros Mi-17, así como vehículos blindados, motocicletas, puestos de mando y vehículos anfibios aplicados a tareas de seguridad pública. El poema entona 173 perros adiestrados para la SAT, la PGR y la SSP. En ningún lugar lees el mundo que me produjo. Nada sobre los 173 perros. Cuando leemos literatura, leemos el presupuesto del ejército mexicano. Cuando percibimos artefactos artísticos, percibimos el presupuesto del ejército mexicano. Si algún elemento de la estructura no cumple criterios de resistencia, son insertadas nuevas articulaciones con momentos constantes. Con momentos constantes como la empresa Colt Defense y sus rifles de 5.56 milímetros para el uso de fuerzas estatales. Con momentos constantes como la empresa Sig Sauer, que entregó 7.384 armas de fuego a México en 2015, 3.060 rifles de asalto, 505 ametralladoras y 3.819 pistolas. Otras empresas similares han hecho negocios con México, con momentos constantes esculpidos por la compañía Glock, momentos constantes esculpidos por una serie de armas semiautomáticas diseñadas y producidas por el fabricante Glock de Dodge Graham, Austria, con 11.231 momentos constantes, diseñados, producidos y vendidos a la Secretaría de la Defensa Nacional por otros $3 millones, con momentos constantes como el mono aullador Alowata palliata, con su aparato bucal especializado, con su hueso hioides y su laringe desarrolladas, formando con la mandíbula una caja de resonancia que le permite amplificar poderosamente los sonidos, los aspectos reunidos, los aspectos separados. Momentos constantes como el venado cola blanca, que marca su territorio frotando con objetos reunidos y separados sus glándulas preorbitales, tarsales e interdigitales. Con momentos constantes como el conejo de los volcanes, con su vientre grisáceo que se comunica con otros a través del olor segregado por sus glándulas en aspectos reunidos y aspectos separados. Momentos constantes como el arbusto de gobernadora, de flores solitarias de color amarillo y cuyas hojas se dividen en otras más pequeñas de aspecto similar al cuero y aparecen recubiertas de pelillos y resina, recubiertas de aspectos reunidos y aspectos separados. 2. Comienza en cualquier lugar de la totalidad. Comienza, por ejemplo, con 40 aviones de combate, comienza con helicópteros armados con capacidad adicional para el bombardeo de precisión a tierra, bombardeos que son extensión del impacto que recibió en el pómulo mi madre cuando tenía yo 17 años. No he pensado en esta situación por un tiempo que es intransferible. Por un tiempo que es intransferible, no he pensado en los aviones C-295 configurados para transporte militar. Por un tiempo que es intransferible, no he pensado en la adquisición de 6 helicópteros EC-725 para operaciones de alto impacto sobre el pómulo de mi madre. Momentos constantes que parecen comenzar y solo comenzar, como los 72.250 millones para la defensa, según el presupuesto de egresos de la Federación. Con momentos constantes que comienzan para comenzar y comenzar otra vez, y comenzar con 4 radares tridimensionales de largo alcance para el sistema de administración del espacio aéreo. Con momentos que no parecen acabar, no acabar como los 9.164.893 pesos para la adquisición de equipos de medición, analíticos, de pruebas físicas, con tecnología de punta que permite estar en posibilidad de optimizar el tiempo de respuesta en los análisis. Nota: piensa cómo la poesía puede optimizar su sistema de administración, su tiempo de respuesta. Empujamos a un lado la historia. La hacemos nuestra indexicalidad.
Thank you, Will. And thank you, Zoe and Daniel, for inviting us. I'm going to read our translation of the section that Hugo just read. The commonplace. We push history to the side, turn it into our own indexicality. Aspects, wants from others, the world that produced us, moments. Moments to intonate aspects, other moments of discussions about poetry that in the end are discussions about politics. In those discussions, in those moments, the poems intonate aspects, aspects gathered together and aspects kept apart. 1. When the poem intonates aspects from ones gathered together and others kept apart, in truth, it intonates 45 pickup trucks equipped with X-rays for the SSP, intonates in truth 43 ion scanners for Sedena, 155 CT-30 detection kits. The poem intonates unmanned aircraft, Mi-17 helicopters, as well as armored vehicles, motorbikes, command posts, and amphibious vehicles applied to public security tasks. The poem intonates 173 dogs trained for the SAT, PGR, and the SSP. Nowhere do you read the world that produced me. Nothing about the 173 dogs. When we read literature, we read the budget of the Mexican army. When we perceive art, works, we perceive the budget of the Mexican army. If some element of the structure does not fulfill criteria of resistance, new articulations are inserted with constant moments. With constant moments, such as the company called Defense and its 1,000 5.56 millimeter rifles for the use of state forces. With constant moments, such as the company Sig Sauer that delivered 7,384 firearms to Mexico in 2015, 3,060 assault rifles, 505 machine guns, 3,819 pistols. Other similar companies have done business with Mexico, with constant moments sculpted by the Glock company. Constant moments is sculpted by a series of semi-automatic weapons designed and produced by the manufacturer Glock GmbH of Deutsche Wagram, Austria, with 11,231 constant moments designed, produced, and sold to the Secretary of National Defense for another $3 million. With constant moments like the howler monkey, Alouatta palliata, with its oral apparatus specialized with its hyoid bones and developed larynx, forming with the mandible a resonating chamber that allows the powerful amplification of the sounds, the aspects gathered together, the aspects kept apart. Constant momentum like the white-tailed deer that marks its territory by robbing objects gathered together and kept apart with its preorbital, tarsal, and interdigital glands. With constant moments like the volcano rabbit with its grayish belly that communicates with others through a scent secreted by its glands, in aspects gathered together and aspects kept apart. Constant moments like the creosote bush with solitary yellow-colored flowers and whose leaves divide into others, even smaller with a similar aspect to leather, and appear as if covered in tiny hairs and resin, covered in aspects gathered together and aspects kept apart. 2. Begin in any place of the totality. Begin, for example, with 40 combat aircraft. Begin with helicopters armed with additional capacity for the precision bombing of land. Bombers that are an extension of the impact on my mother's cheekbone when I was 17. I haven't thought about the situation for a time that is non-transferable. For a time that is non-transferable, I haven't thought about the C-295 airplanes configured for military transport. For a time that is non-transferable, I haven't thought about the acquisition of 6 EC-725 helicopters for high-impact operations on the cheekbone of my mother. Constant moments that seem to begin and only begin. like the 72,250 million for defense, according to the federal expense budget, with constant moments that begin only to begin and begin again. And begin with 4 tridimensional long-range radars for the system of aerospace administration, with moments that seem not to end like the 9,164,893 pesos for the acquisition of measurement analysis and physical testing equipment with cutting-edge technology that allows for the potential optimization of response time in the analysis. Note, think about how poetry can optimize your management system, your response time. We push history aside. We turn it into our own lexicality.
All right, should we continue? Okay. Well, thank you again for inviting us. I didn't say that, and I think I should say that I'm really happy to have this audience here and be part of this space. So, número 3, perdón. Bellas Artes se erigió primero sobre una plataforma flotante, 23 columnas y 2 pilastras para los 3 pórticos, 2 columnas para el pórtico de entrada de la fachada principal, 27 columnas para las fachadas laterales. Se dispusieron 4 bajorrelieves de figuras femeninas en las fachadas laterales. Lees sobre mascarones de animales. Leemos que representan al coyote, el chivo, el mono y el perro Aida, la mascota de Adamo Boari. Lees sobre los mascarones de cabezas humanas en el palacio. Los mascarones de cabezas humanas representan el fusil FX-05 Xiucoatl con lanzagranadas y bayoneta y 2 aviones interceptores. Leemos sobre mascarones de cabezas humanas que representan las miras telescópicas de rayo láser y el cañón con sistema de enfriamiento y culata ajustable, y un selector para fuego, automático o semiautomático, que representan el presupuesto militar de $7,000 millones, que representan la munición de 5.56 por 45 milímetros, con una cadencia de fuego de 700 a 750 disparos por minuto. Las puertas y ventanas del palacio tienen elementos de la flora y la fauna mexicanas, liras, serpientes, hojas y tallos y palmas en hierro forjado. Los florones contienen elementos como la amapola, la flor de ocote, el girasol, los florones y los mascarones del palacio, hechos por el escultor italiano Giannetti Fiorenzo. Son indistinguibles de los 267.500 miembros activos del ejército mexicano. La fauna es indistinguible de los 267.500 miembros activos, indistinguibles ya de los 76.500 personas en reserva. Los 4 Pegasos del Palacio de Bellas Artes fueron esculpidos por el español Agustín Querol. Los 4 Pegasos llegaron a Veracruz en 1911. Leemos que cada pedestal está conformado por un caballo alado y 2 figuras. Una masculina sobre el Pegaso, que inicia el vuelo y simboliza la elevación de los genios, y una figura femenina que es arrojada a los pies de 9 helicópteros M117. Cada pedestal está conformado por un caballo alado y 6 helicópteros Augusta Westland. Los 4 Pegasos fueron esculpidos por los momentos constantes del gasto triplicado en armas, un 180% de 2012 a 2016. Pegasos y fauna y figura femenina y figura masculina sobre el Pegaso que inicia el vuelo, esculpidos todos por momentos constantes de la U.S. Ordnance Incorporated, que obtuvo una licencia para vender lanzadores de granadas y ametralladoras para uso de la Secretaría de Marina. Pegasos esculpidos por 2.100 catalejos para rifles fabricados por Trigicon Incorporated para la Secretaría de Marina, con un valor de $2.5 millones, 47.2 millones de pesos. Así como la fauna es indistinguible de los 267.500 miembros activos, los Pegasos son indistinguibles de los aviones caza de ataque a superficie. 4. El Palacio de Bellas Artes fue inaugurado de forma oficial el 29 de septiembre de 1934 con la obra teatral La Verdad Sospechosa, de Juan Ruiz de Alarcón. La lámpara circular en el techo de la sala principal, diseñada por el húngaro Géza Marotti, Representa al dios griego Apolo y está rodeada por el Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk para ataque, escolta y reconocimiento. La lámpara circular está rodeada por las importaciones de armamento de México, que creció en un 300% en el periodo 2011-2015. La lámpara circular está rodeada por los 12.208 efectivos de la Sedena. Y está rodeado por los 18 helicópteros SC-725 Super Cougar, con valor de 27.5 millones de euros, unos 600 millones de pesos. La lámpara circular es indistinguible de los 695 vehículos blindados de combate y las 362 aeronaves y los 143 buques. Al escribir, no nos enfrentamos románticamente con la hoja en blanco. El enfrentamiento es más bien histórico. Tomar el lado de Sigüenza y Góngora y proteger de la muchedumbre la biblioteca, como por siglos han hecho las letras mexicanas. Tomar el lado de las formas de vida, el lado de las formas del lenguaje que brotan del motín. Al lado, la historia, nuestra propia indexicalidad.
Just want to echo everyone's thanks to Dan and Zoe. Thanks so much for having us here, and to Hugo for being here. I know Zane and Gero and I are really excited to read this work out loud for the first time. Okay, 3. Bellas Artes was initially erected on a floating platform, 23 columns and 2 pilasters for the 3 porticos, 2 columns for the entrance portico of the principal facade, 27 columns for the lateral facades. 4 bas-reliefs of feminine figures were installed on the lateral facades. You read about animal mascarons. We read that they represent the coyote, the goat, the monkey, and the dog Aida Adamo Bauri's pet. You read about the mascarons of human heads in the Palacio. The mascarons of human heads represent the rifle FX-05 Xucoatl with grenade launcher and bayonet and 12 interceptor aircraft. We read about the mascarons of human heads that represent the telescopic aim of laser sights and the cannon with cooling system and adjustable breech, and a selector for firing automatic or semi-automatic that represents the military budget of $7 million that represents the 5.56 or 5.56 by 45 millimeter ammunition with a firing rate of 700 to 750 rounds per minute. The doors and windows of the Palacio have elements of the Mexican flora and fauna, lyres, serpents, leaves and stems and palms in wrought iron. The flowerings contain elements like the poppy, the acote flower, the sunflower. The flowers and the mascarons of the Palacio, made by the Italian sculptor Giannetti Fiorenzo, are indistinguishable from the 267,500 active members of the Mexican army. The fauna is indistinguishable from the 267,500 active members, indistinguishable even from the 76,500 reserve personnel. The 4 Pegasuses of the Palacio de Bellas Artes were sculpted by the Spaniard Agustín Quebrul. The 4 Pegasuses arrived at Veracruz in 1911. We read that each pedestal is composed of a winged horse and 2 figures, a masculine one on the Pegasus that takes flight and symbolizes the elevation of genius, and a feminine figure thrown at the feet of 9 Mi-17 helicopters. Each pedestal is composed of a winged horse and 6 Augusta Westland AW-109SP helicopters. 4. The Palacio de Bellas Artes was officially inaugurated on September 29, 1934, with the theatrical work La Verdad Sospechosa by Juan Ruiz de Alarcón. The circular lamp in the ceiling of the principal salon, designed by the Hungarian Geza Marotti, represents the Greek god Apollo and is surrounded by the Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk, designed for assault, escorting convoys, and reconnaissance. The circular lamp is encircled by the importation of arms by Mexico, which increased 300% in the period from 2011 to 2015. The circular lamp is encircled by the 212,208 Sedena troops and is surrounded by 18 EC-725 Super Cougar helicopters. with a value of 27.5 million euros, some 600 million pesos. The circular lamp is indistinguishable from the 695 armored combat vehicles and the 362 aircraft and the 143 watercraft. When writing, we do not romantically confront the blank page. Rather, the confrontation is historical. Take the side of Sigüenza and Góngora and protect the library from the masses, as Mexican Letters has done for centuries. Take the side of life forms, the side of the forms of language that sprout from the riot. Beside history, our own indexicality.
Bien, ahora la sección 5. We're almost done, promise. Bien, 5. En el Popol Vuh se registra la rebelión de los objetos y animales en contra de la tentativa humana. Esa revuelta fue recogida en mitos del continente. Con el retorno de cada forma hay animales. Con el retorno hay palos, incluso piedras, trastes, cucharas, comales, tinajas, platos, ollas. Pequeños animales, animales grandes, hay animales domesticados, el perro, el guajolote. Las formas históricas de la imaginación continental registraron el alzamiento de esa materia muerta, irracional, subalterna. Esas formas registraron la operación básica de la poesía, la interrupción. En esa revuelta existe una inmanente lección histórica. La piedra moledora del maíz. La piedra moledora del maíz. Todo el tiempo con nuestras caras nos molían cada día y cada noche al amanecer. And this is a quote, right, from the Popol Vuh. Todo el tiempo con nuestras caras nos molían cada día y cada noche al amanecer. Juli, juli, juk, juk. En maya quiché, joli, joli, juki, juki. En la versión de Jiménez, en la versión de Tedlock, rip, rip, rup, rup. And then the next page is basically just a kind of a condensation of different translations of that sound, the Maya and then the Spanish translation and so on. It's kind of a visual configuration there. Holy, holy, hooky, hooky, holy, holy, rip, rip, rup, rup, holy, holy, hooky, holy, rup, rup, rip, rip, holy, hooky, 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 rip, rup, hook, hook. Disonancia, colapso de un orden anterior, antes, después del sonido, antes, después del sentido. Una nueva nada atraviesa el poema, como el capital atraviesa el siglo, reactivando la insurrección de los objetos, el alzamiento de la materia. 6. Un poema es parte documental, parte infierno, pero primero algo sobre nuestras vidas privadas. El presupuesto de la Sedena a favor de la abstracción, a favor de la forma, a favor de la libertad. 2007, 32.200 millones, 896.500 pesos. 2008, 34.861 millones. 2009, 43.623 millones de pesos. 2010, 43.632 millones de pesos. 2011, 50.000 millones de pesos. 2012, 55.610 millones de pesos.
Again, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for inviting us. Part 5. The Popol Vuh records the rebellion of the objects and animals against the human attempt. That revolt was collected in the myths of the continent. With the return of every form, there are animals. With the return, there are sticks, even stones, dirty dishes, spoons, there are comals, there are earthenware jugs, there are their plates, their pots, small animals, big animals, there are domesticated animals, the dog, the turkey. The historical forms of the continental imaginary recorded the rebellion of that dead, irrational, subaltern material. Those forms registered the basic operation of poetry, the interruption. Within that revolt exists an imminent historical lesson. The grindstone of the maze. All the time with our faces we ground each day and each night until dawn. Huli, huli, hook, hook, in Maya Quiche. Holi, holi, hooky, hooky, in Jimenez's version. Rip, rip, rub, rub, in Tedlock's version. Holy, holy, hooky, hooky, holy, holy, hooky, hooky, rip, rip, rub, rub, holy, holy, hooky, hooky, holy, holy, hooky, hooky, rip, rip, rub, rub, holy, holy, hooky, hooky, holy, holy, hooky, hooky, rip, rip, rub, rub, holy, holy, hook. Dissonance of collapse of a previous order. Before, after sound, before, after sense. A new nothing flows through the poem as capital flows across the century, reactivating insurrection, the insurrection of objects, the rebellion of matter. 6. A poem is part documentary, part inferno. But first, something about our private lives. The budget of Sedena, in support of abstraction, in favor of form, in favor of liberty. 2007, 32,200,896,500 pesos. 2008, 34,861,000,000. 2009, 43,623,000,000 pesos. 2010, 43,632,000,000. 2011, 50,039,000,000 pesos. 2012, 55,610,000,000 pesos. Thank you.
Gracias.
Wow. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much to everybody for that reading. Oh, it's such a wild ride, that poem.
And it continues on for another 2 sections, which you'll have to get a copy of the book yourself.
Yeah,
for the translation.
really need to get hold of it. Yeah, yeah. That I hadn't seen that part at the end with the rebellion of the objects from Popol Vuh. It's incredible stuff. So I think if we could just sort of segue into a chat with Hugo and the members of NAFTA. I'm kind of open about where they want to take this discussion, really. But perhaps if Hugo started off by saying a few words about kind of what he was thinking with this long poem that we've heard. Perhaps something around connections to that title, Lo común, or the commonplace, and how we kind of think through what's going on there, or anything else.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say something briefly. I guess the title kind of came rather easily. Thinking about language as lo común, right? This common thing, which is hard to pin down, of course, to define, et cetera, et cetera. But there's this common, material, exercise, whatever you want to call it, lo común. And in a way, working with language, working with that common material, right? That's one thing that was in my mind. And it's probably, I read it somewhere, I don't know. So, poets working with this common material, right? But on the other hand, I think it's, I guess, emphasizing the thing that it's this how the production of dead, la producción de muerte, and the production of culture are somewhat intertwined. I guess everywhere, but I'm thinking especially in Mexico, right? And I guess the presence of the Palacio de Bellas Artes has a lot to do with that. kind of this crystallization, this manifestation of this thing. It's kind of a horrendous building, right? But it's there, it's so massive, right? Entonces, it just kept coming back, you know, how this building is in itself a crystallization of this, the production of so-called art and so-called culture. But to me, it's just kind of an expression. It's just another moment in this production, this production of events, production of the production of just like the capacity of producing things, right? With all this monies going in different directions. So I kind of was kind of emphasizing that common thread, right? Lo común, and yet no, not very often talked about. La producción de muerte y la producción de cultura, which we are all part of, right? I'm not trying to put, have some kind of, put myself aside from that, but I don't know, language and so on. But maybe the other, speakers have better ideas. I guess that's all I have to say by now.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That's great. I mean, I was really thinking about this kind of necro-political histories when reading the poem as well. Yeah, I mean, maybe if anyone from NAFTA would like to kind of respond to that from a translation perspective.
I think I can respond to that unless Whitney or Zane have anything else to add. But yeah, I think one of the many reasons why we were interested in translating Hugo's work, specifically this one, it's its investment in this sort of like commonplace everydayness that seemed to resonate with our interests in our translation collective and in reflecting about the shared realities that we had coming from different places, but all under the same logic of NAFTA as pointing towards this neoliberal paradigm. I think in one regard, the differences, we're interested in the same kind of scrutiny that Hugo is discussing. Perhaps one way to think about the difference is that whereas he works in production of culture, we're more into imports and exports. So thinking about, translation has this way to reflect about what goes across the border and in what form it does so. It's not so much, obviously, we try to offer resistance to NAFTA. We also understand ourselves to a certain extent as part of this reality. And we try to think along those lines. So the idea of translating the reality of this militarized production of culture or vice versa, this artistic production of a militarized state seem resonant in as much as it can still communicate the similarities and difference in the other two countries.
And even, when, what's the easiest part of this poem to translate? It's the name and the designation number of every single piece of military hardware. Like if we're talking about like translation and import export, like what if this is already translated? It's the name of every helicopter and assault rifle. But and thinking about this poem too, I've been thinking about it a lot in the last week here, which has also sort of coincided with a renewed look at the residential school system in Canada. And it's thinking of reading this today and thinking about it today and thinking about it in that context. It's like, well, one of the universities in Canada is Ryerson University, and it's named after someone who was the architect of the public school system in Canada, but he was also I think like a headmaster or something at a residential school. So it's always, the production of culture and the production of death are intertwined. And in the case of Canada, it's specifically Indigenous deaths that are being are the cost of culture or whatever. Or have been the acceptable cost in Canada for its entire fucking history up until the present and future.
Yeah, I think one thing that really drew me to this work was kind of the palimpsestic attention to violence throughout time, beginning long before the Porfiriato and the construction of Bellas Artes. But, the poem goes back to the sort of chinapas, the Nahua form of agriculture that, Mexico City used to be a lake with a very, developed system for growing crops, and has since been drained to build, construct the city on top of it. And I thinking about also Bellas Artes on top of the chinapas, and then Bellas Artes as not only a national symbol of culture, but also like the most prestigious poetry prize in Mexico is, of course, the Bellas Artes. The Premio de Bellas Artes. And so thinking of kind of the way in which that is like a physical manifestation of, what we end up with on the page, the production of culture. And I think the sense of interruption that the poem emphasizes is really important to the way that we think about these kind of flows, imports, exports. There's kind of a utopian gesture around lo común, right? A shared language, finding ways to resist, taking the side of the life forms and the forms of language, right? But that are constantly being interrupted by the interjection of military aircraft. And the budget of particular institutional formations within the city and country of Mexico. So yeah, I think for me, I mean, I study documentary poetics. I'm writing a dissertation about it. And to me, this feels like engaged with that tradition and yet totally kind of undermining or critiquing it at the same time. And so I was just really moved by I saw Hugo read from this book at a bookstore in Mexico City, and it was really just unlike anything that I had read in any language or that I had come across in my research. So yeah, it's been a real honor and pleasure to work through it with Zane and Gero and Hugo too.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, I think it's like that word indexicality is kind of seems to contain a lot of that stuff, doesn't it? Around the weaponry and kind of like serial trade kind of serial numbers translating themselves endlessly in this kind of infinite plane of capital and value, and like making explicit that kind of elision that you were talking about between like actual trade and imports and exports, and then what you're doing with translation, kind of moving things around in the discursive world. Maybe now is a good moment to talk about the relationship between like you guys calling yourselves NAFTA and this like audacious maneuver, and like kind of a bit more on real NAFTA, and maybe Hugo would like to say something about his previous work on the trade treaty itself and how we kind of see these aspects intersecting here.
Yeah, I definitely can feel the one about what it's funny, yesterday I came up with the new version of our name, which it'll retain the same acronym, but we're going to call ourselves now the No America Fraught Translation Argument. Because we often seem to find ourselves, it's the problem with being a three-headed dog, right? Is that one of us is always nipping at the other, and anytime we try to translate anything, it's always this like round and round and round about as each one tries to like push the ball in towards their corner or whatever. But it started as a joke. There's at NYU, where I'm a grad student, there's money available for graduate student working groups, which is to link it to the previous conversation. A lot of that money comes because NYU has a satellite campus in Abu Dhabi, and any department that sends a professor to Abu Dhabi for a term or two gets a bunch of money kicked back to spend in the department. And so I thought, why not do like a translation group and jokingly call it North American Free Translation Agreement. My partner in the endeavor thought that was too provocative of a name, and then a couple years later, I met Whitney and Gero and suggested the idea to them, and we met through a conference. Shout out to Harris Feinsod and Edgar Garcia, and Stephen Park, I believe, was the third organizer of the seminar we were at. And yeah, we just, it started as a joke, and then it sort of became slightly more serious when we started getting things published. And I mean, I could continue talking, but if one of the rest of you wants to chime in, just some, you know, some big boorish Canadian approached you at a conference and said, hey, let's start translating.
I mean, maybe I would Hugo like to say something about the work on NAFTA in the previous book, perhaps. But it's fine if you don't want to.
No. Yeah, I have in front of me. Bonnie and Auntie Humboldt.
Hey.
They're good friends. They're good friends already, I hope.
Hi.
So yeah. So I'd rather wait and see if anyone else has something to say. But I mean, this idea of linking both works, it never occurred to me, but it's obvious when you read from the, I guess, from when you're not the author, I guess that makes sense. But I guess, you know, what it's common to both works, to Lo Común and Auntie Humboldt, is this idea of, first of all, kind of moving in a different direction from what I see, what I perceive as kind of the you know, the established kind of you know, tonality or type of language that is used in Mexico, right? Mexico is very much about the literary scene is very much about the tradition, right? And so, not entirely, but the tradition is very much, you know, present. So I guess with both works, I've been trying to work with, you know, something that is entirely, you know, foreign or different or to that specific habits. And some people don't like it. That's fine. And that's a reaction, right, to this type of why are you wasting time reading the NAFTA? You know, I remember some colleagues in Mexico City saying that NAFTA had no impact on Mexico whatsoever, which to me is a very you know, centrist type of, this is our world and that's all there is. So I guess, you know, after living in the US for several years, you kind of start, you know, looking at things from a more, I guess, I don't know, transnational, I guess, type of, you know, point of view. But I'm just saying obvious things. Why don't you, someone else go ahead and say something. I'll come back to this, but I guess that's one thing I would say. Yeah, that's a common, one of the common things between those two works. Yes.
Would anyone else like to follow on from there?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear Hugo talk about the reception in Mexico City, in particular in Mexico. My experience, you know, with the poetry scene here is still a very intensely dominated, like by the lyric, right? And I think it's important also to kind of draw attention briefly, at least, to the kind of cultural work that Hugo does through translation, because experimental poetry in Mexico, there's of course a long and rich tradition of it, but as far as getting experimental poets into Spanish, there's a much kind of less robust genealogy one can draw, and the work that he's done in translating a book like Williams's Patterson, you know, or Oppen, you know, and I think of course there are resonances between Lo Común, right, and Oppen's work, and now Shambani, you know, these are really significant, I think, interventions or interruptions in poetry in Spanish, in Mexico in particular, but I think, you know, also through, you know, the entire literary tradition by bringing authors like this into Spanish. And I think it's worth, you know, just mentioning that. But I think for me, if Auntie Humboldt was sort of about the way that neoliberalism affects language, or I don't know, it's like these books are very much in dialogue, right? Like it's about death, language flows, capital, cultural production, and the inability to sort of find oneself outside that network, right? And it's like, how does one create in under the conditions that we all find ourselves in? And I feel like, and it's interesting, I think, to note also, you know, like people telling him like this is going to have no impact in Mexico. And I think this is one of the most important books in the past 10 years, 20 years, you know, at least within the literary tradition in the US. It comes up in many different articles and books. And as far as a politically oriented process, poetics, I think, you know, was a crucial intervention also into poetry in English. And I love that it's a collaboratively published edition. I think that is a model I would love to see more of, and that I would love to do, to find ways to bring together publishers in the US and Mexico to have more events, you know, like this, and like the one, you know, that I first met Hugo at. But I think also there's something really deeply, I just was thinking as you were reading, as we were reading, about the moment of sort of like domestic violence that appears in this poem. And it's really, really fast. You know, I mean, it's really just drawing the connection between kind of domestic patriarchal violence, the jawbone, you know, and the larger structures under which this is happening. And, you know, everything's sort of an index, right? Bellas Artes is an index. This moment of violence is an index. The military weapon indexes. All of this contributes to sort of the system in which we find ourselves in. And I just find that one moment, I mean, that is the one moment where we really get any kind of picture of the speaker. And I think it's really powerful. And I think that for me, that moment distinguishes the two projects. I mean, there are many different things, you know, I think this one is much more oriented and grounded space, history, time in the city of Mexico. But yeah, I don't know if you guys have anything to say. I don't know.
I mean, I keep thinking and like very quickly before we open it. It's been an interesting exercise for us, the kinds of dialogues that go into translating this. This dynamic where there's both the attempt at resistance, but also the replication of the dynamics that we're trying to resist, as a continual reminder of the bounds in which we sort of move on our everyday lives. So for us, I think it's produced an ongoing reflection about translation, as I mentioned, imports and exports, but also, as Zane was pointing to, like those objects that already emphasize their alienness, that are marked as alien, and that circulate as such, really pulling the act of translation into this global market where we're seeking some room to maneuver, some room of agency that could amount to, you know, opening doors for dialogues that are not currently happening, and projects that still seemed excluded from what happens in the literary industries of the three countries. So those kinds of processes have been, I think, revealing to us, have been helpful, especially when dealing with work such as Hugo's, which already takes that as the object of its scene of production. Yeah.
I want to come back to that, to what Whitney said about translation as a kind of political literary intervention. I think that's been key to me. And all of my translations have this history of not finding a place to be published in, right? And that kind of says a lot about the place that translation has in Mexico right now, right? Or the place that doesn't have. And one thing I emphasize always to some colleagues, and they don't necessarily like it, right, is when I say that we have to pay attention also to poets, not only to our contemporary poets who have cultural capital that we can, you know, but also, you know, poets are no longer with us, you know. One example was Williams, right? Oppen, who spent 10 years in Mexico. And so there's all these poets there whose works are, you know, major. but they don't have like this immediate, we can't chat with them on Facebook, right? So there's not this exchange of capital, cultural capital. And I feel like that's the kind of exchanges that sometimes have been happening in Mexico with the with local translators doing work or translating work from other places. So just the fact of doing work with poets that are no longer here, to me, is a kind of a dialogue, not translation of this kind of dialogue that is not happening in real time in a way with someone who's alive, right? So that to me, it's a kind of a literary intervention, right? Spending time, like a friend of mine says, translation is spending time with dead people, right? And sometimes it's not, anyhow. So I see that work, the work of translation as a key. And I see, working with this kind of, I'm not gonna say obscure figures because they're, well-known writers, but they're not, on Twitter. So working with this type of figures, I think, is to me a way of, calling attention to other, aesthetics, other works that are there, but they don't circulate in Mexico. So yeah, so that's one thing, right? To see translation as a political also, in the way that kind of creates this malestar. What is the way to translate malestar in English? Malestar, esta incomodidad, digamos, ¿no?
Yeah, discomfort.
Discomfort, right? With poetics that are somewhat, formally, challenging, formally demanding, and also politically, very much active, thinking in the case of George Oppen, of course, and Sean Bonney now. Anyhow, but I'm going in circles here.
I think that would be a really nice moment, actually, to maybe hear a few of the Bonney translations, if you don't mind. We're going to open up to the to audience questions in just a moment. So if you want to type in your questions into the chat, that would be great. And I think we're just going to read 2 pages from, if anyone has their copies of Letters Against the Firmament accessible. I think it's just going to read the first page of Lamentations, which is on page 16. Yes, page 16. And then from page 123 from Letters Against the Firmament. So if people want to just grab it, if you have a copy around. Otherwise.
So the book just came out. It has this, I think it's a photograph from the 19th century from the actual barricades. I was surprised. I didn't know that the publisher was doing this. And it has an introduction by William Rowe. Anyhow, I'm really glad that this finally came out. So, en los días de nuestra más encarnizada rabia, la precisión de la belleza, la dicha del mundo entero, el pan remojado en su oscuridad, los enemigos oprimían sus bocas contra nosotros, una cepa entre tú y yo. Nadie hay que nos consuele, de la música encarcelada, los injuriados y los de verdad desdichados, de los nombres de los responsables de masacres recientes, sobre la numerología del canto de aves, sobre el disturbio sustituido por el canto de aves, nuestros perseguidores más veloces que águilas, nos persiguen por las montañas, tumbados nos esperan en los páramos, y nuestras vocales colectivas zumbando como un dron, lo invisible, sea lo que eso sea, y si no se cernía sobre nosotros, anunciándose como una llama azul, la ley es una boca, glosolalia. No sé si quieras leer el original. You want to read the original or no?
Could do. Well, I think Do we think that'd be a good idea? Yes. Okay. In the days of our fiercest anger, the precision of beauty, the joy of the whole world, soaked bread in their darkness. Enemies press their mouths on us. A snare is come among us. There are none to comfort us. Of music imprisoned, the insulted and truly wretched, of the names of those responsible for the recent massacres. On the numerology of birdsong, on riot replaced by birdsong, our persecutors swifter than eagles. They pursued us on the mountains, laid wait for us in the wilderness, and our collective vowels humming like drones, the invisible, whatever that is, as if it didn't hover above us, announce itself with blue fire. The law is a mouth, glossolalia.
Okay, and then the second one, the other one we could... entendí el dinero como cuchillo, empleando lo centrífugo, Londres, ascuas de una ciudad abstracta, capital en rojo y negro, dormía, nosotros despiertos en su interior, lo opuesto es igualmente cierto. Ha bloqueado la antimateria del yo que habla, ha secretado memoria, confrontado su ser como un amor burgués, esa monstruosidad caníbal en la cual el gobierno hace la guerra a la transparencia, producida por el pensamiento. Una diminuta enzima disolvió la historia de nuestro rostro, privatizó el lugar y la fórmula, la conciencia en exilio, la masa sin número, la insurrección es valor, los significados despellejan el lenguaje enemigo.
I understood money as a knife, would use that centrifuge. London, rotating embers of an abstract city, capital in red and black. It was sleeping, we were awake inside it. The opposite is also true, has blocked the antimatter of the speaking I, has secreted memory, confronted its being as bourgeois love, that cannibal monstrosity wherein government is at war with thought's productions of transparency. A pretty little enzyme dissolved our face's history, privatized the place and the formula. Consciousness in exile, mass without number, insurrection is value. Meanings excoriate the enemy language.
Yeah, gracias.
that's just like a little taste of this amazing. I can't wait to see this book. I think we can we can move. Oh, there's loads of questions in the chat. Gosh, would you like to read your questions out, questioners, or not? I mean, if you want to. So first we have.
All the questions will be answered by Whitney. That was the understanding.
Oh yeah, that was the real free trade agreement.
That was the free trade agreement.
We have a question from Felix Wardle, who is actually called Annie, I suspect. Would you like to read it out, or should I?
Yeah, so I was just interested in the actual translation process, and yeah, what it's like translating with three people. Zane, you kind of hinted at that a bit, but I'm curious about that, and also, yeah, whether you have a particular kind of aesthetic approach in mind, and also whether, yeah, I really like, Gero, what you were saying about the kind of import-export side of literature, and I was wondering whether you have that in mind and whether that affects your choices as you're translating.
I'd be happy to talk about the nuts and bolts because I don't have anything intelligent to say, unlike Whitney and Gero, but for Lo Común, what happened was Whitney, as she said, she came across Hugo reading it in a bookstore and thought that we should do it together, and scanned it and uploaded it and all that. And in this particular case, I took the first rough pass at it and just did it in sort of like in a fever dream over like 24 hours when I was trying to avoid doing my dissertation, and which is great for me because my Spanish is terrible. And Whitney and Gero came through afterwards and fixed all my mistakes, which is one thing that I really love about the three-headed dog of us, is that like each of us has our things that we're good at and things that we're less good at, and the three of us together, I think it as I hinted at earlier, it can cause some more disagreements than working on your own or in a pair, but I think just doing it with three people, that it's one of those things that they always say, like there's like the the fourth brain or whatever when there's three people collaborating or whatever, but I think we kind of each compensate for each other in important ways.
Yeah, I guess one interesting thing about us is we're all sort of very much beginning as translators, collectively, but also individually. And we never sat down and had a conversation about the politics of translation or even our approaches to translation or what we consider the priority in translation. I think the selection question that you brought up is something that we have definitely talked about, and I think we are very much inspired by the kinds of interventions Hugo's making in his own translation work, and are trying to do that in a way that also includes Canada as part of the network of exchange. But yeah, because we never really had this conversation about what it means or anything. We just kind of jumped into it on a Google Doc. And then kind of all of those differences or questions came up as we were in the process of looking over kind of Zane's first draft of the translation. And, you know, I think if you consider translation a kind of interpretation, which I think, you know, is a pretty common way to understand it, you know, then you have to negotiate that we have three different potential interpretations of a work going on at once, and that manifests on the individual level of words, right, phrases. I was like really convinced at the beginning that this was like super in dialogue with Oppen, and that we should pull from Oppen's diction, and we like, you know, argued. Like I think it's also productive to talk about, you know, I think there's kind of a fetishization of collaboration within the neoliberal institution, probably because it's challenging, you know. And people don't really talk that much about how collaboration can lead to argument and friction. And I think it can be productive, you know, and it's helpful that, you know, we had a history of being friends and going to conferences together. And it's not like we were three strangers jumping into the project, but, you know, we still are getting to know one another and what exactly our politics are and what our positionalities are relative to our nations. And so yeah, I mean, our arguments definitely came up, but I think they were productive ultimately. But that, yeah, I mean, you're like with three different interpretations, and then poetry, of course, being a genre or a type of writing that you can never really pin down to one particular interpretation, just makes for a lot of different possibilities, right?
I think there's also this kind of fetishization of translation, and that's you know, I love reading about translation, but there is this kind of assumption sometimes that there is some kind of huge theoretical apparatus behind each translator, when in fact it's you know, which that happens, of course, but then in you know, thanks to theory, in a way, you know, recent theory, or probably the entire century, there's all this kind of ideas about these idealizations of the work as translation too. And I kind of resist that. I admire when people write about it and I love it. I can't say a word about translation. And so, you know, my own issues. But the thing here is, in a way, I try to resist this idea of translation as a kind of a precious activity that requires some kind of endless intellectual agonizing inner debate or something like that. And I try to, I mean, the one thing I have in mind when I translate is I'm just doing this so people in Mexico can read something else besides the three things that they adore, right? And so kind of just to break with this other fetish of the tradition in Mexico, right? And that's kind of my only thing when I do translations. This is like trying to break, so try to do some kind of intervention, that's it. But the intervention will be through the book, not through my own discourse on translation. But other people do it, and it's fine. But I sometimes resist this, or maybe it's just my own inability to do it. But I find it a little, I don't know, I don't want to say dangerous, but I find it a little, well, look, let's call it dangerous. This idealization of the task of translation as something that only some people can do, or that requires some, spending 25 years reading Derrida or Levinas or whatever. That's important, but I don't think it's a requirement. And as long as that's seen as a requirement, it kind of impossibilitates other people from actually doing it. Anyhow, that's my rant.
And to develop that thought also, like one aspect that I've found real interesting about our collaboration is the division of labor that takes place, like really on a more mundane level, all the work that has to go into translating. And even though our division of labor exists and is flexible, it fluctuates constantly. Sometimes you have to do something, sometimes you have to do another thing. The collective aspect of it does signify for me as some aversion of the collective against the measures of austerity that we all face, and just like the precarious situations that we find in terms of like our future employability or lack thereof, but the reliance on other people in our same situation as creating a collective of support where the labor is distributed according to everyone's needs. So that exercise in itself as already projecting alternative futures for some version of the humanities, if it is to survive, has been revealing new panoramas. And yeah, I mean, it's still, again, I don't want to dwell too much on like the utopian possibilities of this, because it's mostly mundane. It's just like staring at the screen and having this sometimes heated conversations about what's the best translation of a specific word. But in that labor, there's many possibilities that open themselves.
I was reminded of this anecdote that about Borges. An Argentinian friend of mine shared this anecdote with me. It was about translating Joyce, right? So apparently, this is what I know. That's the version I know. When Ulysses came out, Borges called for a meeting with some of his friends, writers and translators, to decide what's the best way to translate Joyce. And so they had this meeting, and all of a sudden the book came out translated by someone who no one knew, Salas Subirats, that's his name, Jose Salas Subirats, who I think his job was selling insurance from door to door, an obscure person. And he said, okay, that's a good translation. Yeah. So that kind of always reminds me how they're complete, separate, communities or ideas about what it's required, and sometimes it's just the doing. And anyhow, I just love that idea of Borges calling for a meeting, and all of a sudden the work is done somewhere else, underground. Yeah.
So we have some more questions. We have one from CJ Stevens, which I could read, or CJ could read if they want to interject at this moment.
I can read. Hi, yes, thank you so much. And yeah, as a background, just for context of my question, I'm a PhD student writing a dissertation. And my dissertation is for the love of nonsense, leaning towards an ontology of the non-narrative. And I bring in the audio sphere and then the visual sphere. And that's where poetry is this thing that or event that I can talk about, but I'm still so interested in the fact that it seems to transcend both spheres, and not that any of these spheres are closed, they're considerably open. But my question, I have two, but they're integrative, however you want to answer or address, is how is poetry inherently unique or singular, and also relational and political? And my second question is, how does translation seem to transcend the visual and audio sphere divide? Or maybe that's not divided to you. I would love to hear more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know who would like to have a go at one or either of those.
I guess I can start. I really like the phrase that you use, non-narrative. I think that's really important to me in answering the first question. Or it's not that poetry can't be narrative. Of course, there's epic poems, etc. But I think at least taking a moment to take the risk of speaking for all of us. I know we're all deeply concerned with history and political history, intellectual history, the history of cultural production, contextualizing the poets that we're working on and with and through kind of in their respective social milieu of their time, as well as like a larger geopolitical understanding of those, where those groups then emerged, how or why or under what conditions. And I think for me, I hesitate to be like poetry is special, although I think it is special. But I think one thing that I'm really interested in what poetry or political poetry does is the way that it intervenes sort of in the narratives that construct our daily lives, whether that is sort of like racial relations, whether that's a history of the state, of a nation, of what brings us together as citizens. I think poetry in refusing often to work with narrative or foregrounding other aspects can create alternative possibilities, alternative uses of language. And in thinking about the expanding the possibilities and the limits, I guess, of lo común, of language itself. And I think that kind of ties into the question of translation, which is that when you bring, different authors or poets into a new language, you are then expanding the possibilities of that language, right? And that literary tradition, and who can be in dialogue with those authors. And I guess, so that's what I would say about the visual and audio sphere. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, because of course, in the translation of poetry, there are aspects, there's all these long theoretical conversations about untranslatability, or being faithful, being a traitor, whatever kind of narrative of translation that you want to adhere to. But there is an aspect of sound that is very, very challenging, especially in Spanish, a very musical language, English, can be kind of rough, Anglo-Saxon, gritty language. Sound is something that doesn't always carry over, and you kind of have to figure out how to create musical moments, maybe not where they are in the original, but maybe a little further up on the page or a little further down, or try and see what the original is doing and then replicate that, but it may not always be in the same place, right? But I do think the image is one thing. It's not always gonna, of course, nothing translates like 100% over, right? But I think that using the image as maybe one thing that can be translated a little better than sound sometimes. I don't know. I feel like I'm just speculating at this point, but obviously the image is crucial to your first question too, right? The foregrounding of the image over story, over time, the foregrounding of space in poetry.
I think even just to follow up on Whitney, this question of sound between English and Spanish has been one of the real contentious points, because Whitney tends toward kind of more natural and kind of mellifluous phrasings of the translation, whereas I think me and Gero, or me at least, tend towards more like the very like clunky, include every of and every the and every one of those little tiny building block words to make it more kind of like chunky and awkward. Which is to say, I hope we balance each other out as we go. But yeah, that sort of trying to think through the sonic register, and even to sort of build on that too. Even I often find myself thinking about the sort of visual appearance of the poem on the page, and how to sort of replicate the line breaks and the line lengths, and that kind of stuff as well.
I think we have just time for one more question, I think. Yeah, I totally get that about the flatness and like kind of anti-poetry kind of obstructiveness. Yeah. I'm just scrolling to look for the question. Oh, it was from Mao. Mao is potentially on a bus on the M1. I don't know if they want to read their question or if I should.
Oh, I've gotten off the bus. It's
Oh, amazing.
Maybe the experience of being on a bus for 6 hours will change before I'm able to ask. I'll try anyways. Yeah, my question is about the words representar and idéntico in the poem, and I'm wondering because you say, because it's both like by a totalizing indictment of like official Mexican culture, which I love, and there's also like the fact that the things you are using the word representar for themselves are like technologies of representation. So I'm thinking of like the radar technology or the scopes or the, you know, the cockpits of these fighter planes or whatever. So yeah, I'm wondering if you could say anything about those words representar, maybe like what you think that word does for your poetics and your work in this concept, and the translators can chime in because they are trying to represent something, aren't they? So
I think that's such a brilliant point. Sorry, did someone want to take it?
No, I was gonna say it again because I thought it maybe you didn't hear it because the quality was bad, but you did. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's something we've talked about, is it? But I think that's such a brilliant connection between the way in which these military technologies surveil, represent, allow for a particular kind of vision. And then again, kind of going back to my previous comments, like the foregrounding of the image in poetry, representation in language. And I think it just goes back to Hugo's comment between cultural production and death being, you know, absolutely intertwined, right? Yeah, I'm gonna have to think a lot more about that question, but it's very, very generative for me. Thank you. I think something that I would love to talk about with these guys eventually.
This is totally in a different direction, but because so many of you are British, it's what's in my mind. It reminds me of, there's that one Alan Fisher poem where he's talking about the radar waves sort of like reaching out and surveilling the countryside. Can't quite remember what the hell one it was, but thinking about sort of thinking about military technology as a form of representation gets me thinking about Alan Fisher.
Yeah, and also Andrea Brady's amazing essay Drone Poetics, right, which is all about that kind of kill box sighting of like lyric as a necropolitical technology. Yeah. Would we have any more comments from Hugo or from Gero or on that matter of military technology?
Actually, trying to find this Sean Bonnie poem on satellites and eyes, but I can't find it, of course. It's one of his translations of Baudelaire, so it's pretty appropriate. Where he replaces all these words and has I found it. Is there a way for me to do a screen share? Yeah, can I do that?
Yeah, I think you're one of the hosts, so yeah, you can.
Okay, so let me do it. I found my PDF. Let's see. Oh no, I'm disabled as for to screen sharing. It says here.
Right. Zoe, is it possible to enable screen share for Hugo?
Okay, got it. So here it is. This is the correspondences, or I don't know how you say that in French. Anyone? And so it's kind of, I mean, speaking of, this is very much, also Sean Bonnie's project also, right? To rethink translation through history, or translation as something that is completely soiled by history. And so let me read this for you. Correspondences. La naturaleza es una ruina. Sus pilares reventados agitan y mutilan palabras. Nosotros deliramos en su interior y ellos nos ven como satélites, cámaras y ojos. Sus ecos nos cortan, somos sombras inmensas como la noche y la mañana, somos hedor y color y sonido y nada. Más a veces es tan suave como un niño, un violín o un pastizal del desierto, o una explosión, materia infinita de ámbar y almizcle, la fusión, disolución de espíritu y sentido. Yeah, I was just reminded of this idea of the cameras and the surveillance in a Baudelaire poem. Of course, why not?
Just in quick response to Zoe's comment and Zoe and Whitney's conversation in the chat there about, poems, documentary poems, as in poems that are based on documents. That's been one of the sort of, and of course, because anti-Humboldt as well kind of comes up in this dialogue, is it's one thing that we keep wanting to translate, for example, Jordan Abel or like Norbese Philip into Spanish, but those texts are so closely tied to their source texts, right? That like Jordan Abel's book is, a lot of Jordan Abel's books are erasure poems or combination poems of other like colonial era texts and stuff like that. And so it's like, how does one translate that? Like, do you repeat the process but with texts from the target language, or like do you just like translate the poem as it appears? And I almost think like there's a way in which like repeating the process, though not necessarily the poem, is almost like the more appropriate way of translating works like that. But
yeah, but that does seem to be what's happening, that there is some kind of translation of approach going on that is making something really, really new and amazing. I suppose, I mean, if we have got time, I was also thinking, I'm seeing this in relation to sort of US poetry, but I just wondered is there like time for just a word or two more on like what are the precedents for this in Mexico or in other Spanish language poetry, like. Or not. Yeah.
In thinking of conceptualism or lo común in particular, or okay.
Yeah, so I suppose yeah, that question about that if conceptualism sort of has this kind of like, almost like a new lease of life, as it were, in Spanish. I mean, it's not just something that's coming from English. It's what other languages is it coming from, and what other traditions, and where any pointers that you would.
I guess I can mention briefly, if I can. When I was working on this project, I had no idea about conceptualism and all that. My readings were completely different. I feel closer, for example, to Brazilian, poetics, aesthetics, like the concreto poetas concretistas from Brazil in the 50s. And then all this conversation about whether or not this was, part of a conceptualist lineage and so on. But, I think there are precedents. In Mexico, there are some precedents, but they tend to be completely, I would say, apolitical, completely more, virtuoso type of, works. And I guess the closest thing would be, of course, someone like, poets from Brazil in the 50s, 60s, or even Parra, for example, in Chile, right?
Yeah.
But that's what I have to say, yeah.
Yeah, I think Parra is so like absolutely essential in this conversation. And I think that there's a way in which it may appear that conceptualism can have a new life in Latin America, but I guess I would really recommend this book from Texas by Luis Kamenzer that really, I think, draws a long history of tradition of conceptualism in Latin American art. And he really begins kind of with the historic avant-garde. So like Huidobro as kind of a kind of father of conceptualism in a way, and reads through Parra. And I think that certainly Carlos's work is super exciting, and I think there's one way you can tell that story through conceptualism, but I also think there's a very long history of conceptualism in Latin America, a different kind of narrative that emerges from the historical avant-garde and maybe even older.
And sorry, just to mention one name that is a key figure for the development of conceptual art in Mexico. Ulises Carrion has been receiving a lot of attention recently, and there we go. The sonnets were recently published by UDP, so just another person to take a look at.
Great, thank you. Okay.
Well, I think it's an amazing discussion. It could just sort of roll on, couldn't it, with like with these kind of recommendations. But I guess we should probably draw things to a close and say thank you very much, muchas gracias, to Hugo and Gero and Zane and Whitney and Zoe and everybody and everyone for coming along. It's been a really wonderful discussion. I guess, Zoe, do you want to hit stop? Because I think you were recording, so maybe if you hit stop, that's best. I'm not sure if it. There we go.